So to start out, I just want to, can everybody shut their eyes for just a second? I want to take you back to a moment as a kid. I want you to picture yourself standing on a rock ledge over a lake, or maybe a diving board over a pool, or even at the top of a slide. Your toes are hanging over the edge, and your friends are already at the bottom, yelling for you to come down. You can hear your heart pounding. You can feel your stomach rising into your throat. You know you want to do it. You've seen others do it before you, but you're stuck in place. You're thinking, what if it's too high? What if this hurts? Or what could happen if things go wrong? And in that moment, it's not the jump that scares you, it's what you don't know. The fear of the unknown can be louder than the thrill of the possibilities. And kind of what I'm going to talk to you guys about tonight is fear, so you can open your eyes. It's going to be about fear, and along the way I've had some moments of fear and kind of how to overcome them. I've learned that to kind of push into fear, because what you want is just on the other side of that fear. So the questions I would say when you're feeling that is, or what is the fear you have about going to the next level? Whether that be buying your first rental property, or going from single family homes up to your first fiveplex or your first duplex. And then the next question would be, well, what's the worst thing that could happen if you do make that decision and do that? I made a horrible decision to write these on double-sided. Because if you never jump, though, the fear just disguises itself as comfort. And I think a lot of people get caught in that, is you kind of feel, you want to do it, you see other people doing it, but you just get comfortable where you're at. And so, yeah. So let me ask you something. Have you ever stood at the edge of something in your life knowing there was more waiting for you, but you were too afraid to leap? Have you ever hesitated, not because you weren't ready, but because you couldn't guarantee the outcome? Well, that cliff and that hesitation, that moment is what today is about. Because that same fear is just not at the edge of the water. It's in your career decisions that you're going to make, and your investment decisions along the way, and in your goals. We're going to talk about the times that I jumped along the way, and the times that I chickened out and didn't do what I wanted to do. So I didn't know I wanted to get into real estate investing from a young age. I graduated high school, had no idea what I wanted to do. I was told go to college, so started my college career. Then I joined the electrical apprenticeship and started going down that path. And I was making really good money at the time, working as an electrician. But I went through the 2008 crash and saw what it looks like when you don't have work as an electrician. And I had a lot of older guys that said, hey, if you can go back to college, make that happen, because there's going to be ups and downs in this trade of work. It was around that time that I met my wife. She was finishing up her journalism degree at WSU, and she got an offer at 3 different places and said that she wanted to take a job in Bend, Oregon. And so at that point, I had to make a decision. Do I continue pursuing my wife, what wasn't my wife at that time, or do I just continue down this path as an electrician? And so I decided at that point, I was driving about 3.5 hours a day to commute back and forth to work. I was working 6/10s as an electrician, and I felt like I was kind of just pretty much working my life away. I was making really good money, but I was just working my life away. So I made the decision to follow my wife over to Bend. I got one journeyman paycheck as an electrician, topped out, and then quit that next week and went back to college to start the next adventure. There's comfort in knowing what tomorrow looks like, and that's exactly what made it so hard to leave. And I was a journeyman electrician making good money, and the benefits were stable. And I'd worked for years to get there. By all accounts, I had made it to the point that I wanted to, that plateau that I thought was making it as a journeyman. But deep down, I knew something was missing. I was walking away from $40 an hour, which at that time seemed like a crazy amount, from a steady career, and going back to college felt insane. and I didn't know what was on the other side of that journey. The fear wasn't about failing, it was about not letting go of something secure in exchange for something unknown. But the idea of staying the same, that scared me more than change ever could. So I got my first paycheck and then headed off to college. So I started college kind of wanting to go as a personal finance person and kind of help other people with money. I'd always kind of liked managing money. Quickly, they pushed me into engineering, which at the time I didn't think I was smart enough to become an engineer. I was good with math and stuff, and I had my electrical background, so I started going down that road. I ended up finishing my engineering program in about 3.5 years. It seemed somewhat easy after having worked 60 hours a week. I mean, I do school like 2 times a week, and then kind of played quite a bit, I felt like. But during that time, we did I flipped cars to help pay for college. Pretty much paid for all my college by flipping cars on the side. We rented a 3-bedroom apartment in that time, and house hacked that kind of. We leased one of the bedrooms to a friend, or not a friend, but somebody we met on Craigslist, which is kind of crazy thinking back, but definitely ignorant at that time. But we rented that for $500, so we were paying $200 in rent in Bend, Oregon, which, you couldn't even get an apartment there for $700 now anyways. But I wanted to own something at that time, and so I started looking at buying homes. And my wife did not make enough money, as she was an entry-level journalist making just above minimum wage. So we started looking, got turned down by banks, couldn't make that happen, so I had to figure out, okay, so I had bought a piece of property when I was about 19 years old on Salem finance. My dad kind of pushed me into doing it, and I was like, sure, that'll save some money, I guess, on the side. So I decided to sell that property and buy a home. So we did that, we sold it, and we figured out that we could get her parents to co-sign on a loan for us to get our first home. And we would split the home 40-60 on the split, and that's how we essentially got into our first home. And it was about a few years later, I think 4 years later, graduated college. I knew I had my first job heading into Portland about two quarters before I quit, or before I got done with college. So I ended up taking out the maximum student loans that they would allow me at the end of my last 2 quarters to use as my down payment for that home over there, because I used all my money in the first home here. So I took that money out. We found a home in Portland. It was kind of a pain. There were definitely multiple offers at that time. But then I decided to rent my Bend home instead of selling it. And I rented it to a friend that I knew, because I had heard this is great to rent your homes and let them pay your mortgage. And did my own leasing, did all that. And it wasn't until I realized I got my first couple mailbox money, I guess you can call it, and I realized he's paying me $1,600 a month, and I was paying $915 on my mortgage, that I realized I need to figure out how this works and how to scale this into something bigger. I started off I was driving a lot for my new job. I was driving out to Boardman, Oregon, so it was about 3 hours on Monday morning, 3 hours on Friday, and it was about an hour commute back and forth to the job site each day. So I was consuming as much content as I could, like learning. I was listening to books, I was listening to podcasts. Pretty much every time I was in the car, I was listening. I wasn't listening to any music. I loved learning about this new thing because I saw what it could do and help me in the future. So I decided I wanted to buy my next investment property, but at that point, I didn't have any cash for another down payment. Kind of exhausted my funds. So I was like, I'm going to sell my home in Bend. So we decided to sell that home in Bend, and it gave us about $100,000. And then I started my hunt in the Portland area to look for that next investment property. Now, I had gotten caught up I was listening to Brandon Turner, and they talked about the 2% rule, which I don't know if anybody knows what that means, but it means if say you buy a $100,000 property, it rents for $2,000 a month, 2% of what you purchase it for. Well, those unicorns didn't exist at that time, because I looked at 3 units and 4 units that if I would have just bought any of those deals at that time, I would have been a lot better off than I am now. But then I started I spent a lot of time looking for the perfect investment property, and I remember running the numbers, reading the books, and going down that. But now that I look back on it, I think I wasn't just being cautious, I was kind of searching for the perfect deal as an excuse not to take my next action. It wasn't the analysis, it was the fear disguised as kind of logic, and the fear of doing the wrong thing, and the fear of making a mistake. It was also the fear of calling myself an investor at the time and getting exposed as a fraud. And in that moment, I had to be honest with myself. There was no perfect deal. There was only that first deal. And I learned how to, and looking back, that hurdle wasn't the number. It was kind of more just the fear of starting. And so I got over my analysis paralysis, and I heard in a podcast, you just got to get that first deal under your belt and go through the learning process that comes along with that, with the leases, tenants turning over, and we have problems. And you're going to kind of get into the process of doing it. And that's kind of where it's almost like going back to college in that space. So I found a house in Battleground, Oregon for about $250,000, put 25% down, and got a tenant in there. I think my mortgage was around $1,200, and I was renting it for about $1,600. And day one, the tenants move in, and I get a call on July 4th, and there's water running down the wall by the front entranceway after they took a shower. So I had to run over to there, opened up the ceiling, and fixed a water leak from the main shower. And I started questioning myself, what have I got myself into at this point? So after that, everything kind of started going smoothly. They were the best tenants that I could have ever asked for on that one. But I found another deal. It was a deal for sale on Craigslist, for sale by owner. It was a duplex. And I went and met with the owner. We agreed on a price. I think it was $319,000. And then I said, okay, well, what's the next step now? I didn't really know. I was like, I'll go talk to escrow and see what I need to do. So I went and talked to the escrow company, and they're like, you need a purchase and sale agreement to open escrow. And I had no idea. I was like, okay, I used an agent on my last one, but I didn't really know what that meant, so I got online and started searching for purchase and sale agreements. And I don't recommend this, because I found one from another state, changed all the language, probably wasn't that great, but it did have the inspection contingency, financial contingency, and an appraisal contingency. It was hard to get my wife to move up to this duplex, because we had just remodeled our previous home. She definitely pushed back. We were in Bull Mountain and Tigard, and this home was definitely in a rental neighborhood, and the people next door, it was just trashed. And so we started the renovations, did the painting, and then moved into the house with no floors in it or anything. And then the first night we were living there, my wife's window got broken out in her car. And that didn't help my cause on convincing her that this was a great neighborhood to live in. Came to find out there was a party down the street and somebody got kicked out and they broke out the windows on the way out. That was kind of the one that we kind of cut our teeth on, learning how to do a lot of the renovation projects. I just watched a lot of YouTube videos and learned how to kind of do the sweat equity in the projects myself. Sometimes that works for investors, sometimes it doesn't if you're a handy person or not. I don't know if I recommend it for everybody, but it allowed us to create a lot more equity quicker. This was about the time too that I was definitely working. Every time I got off work at night, I was working until I went to bed. I was definitely working at night or every weekend. I was definitely working on my days off a lot of times. I take vacation days to kind of renovate units at certain points. And people started to say that, Ryan, you're working too hard at this point. My mom started to see the same ethic that my dad had as far as working, which he was a hardworking guy, and started to question my why. And it got me kind of thinking, like, why am I doing this? Why am I working so hard for this? And we were about to have a child at that point, and I started to think, like, well, I want, when my kids are be 4 and 5, 6 years old, to be able to spend as much time with them as I choose at that point. And so that became my why. And I strongly recommend in the real estate space that you have your why of why you're doing this, and not just do it for the money, because it's an endless game that you'll chase forever. So we got that project I renovated it was a duplex. I renovated the tenants next door. I asked if she had any 4-day trips coming up. She had a couple that summer, so when she left, I went into her unit, redid the floors, painted out the unit, kind of quickly, but it sufficed for what we needed to do to get a refinance on the projects. So we refinanced that out and pulled a HELOC on the property, which is kind of a common theme that I did. I kind of did the Burr method to kind of snowball into the next deal to get the down payment for the next deal. It's kind of a long way, but it worked for me at the time. So then I started to look for the next deal. I was driving through Longview. I'd kind of been searching quite a bit for like triplexes and fourplexes. I wanted to go to that next step. And I called a broker I drove by a 4-unit, which I thought was a 4-unit. Saw a for sale sign, called the broker. Definitely took a little courage to call them because I didn't quite feel that confidence. I had the fear of, not being able to say the right thing, not knowing how to talk to the broker at the time. But I called her anyways, and she said, no, that's actually a townhome for sale, but I've got a 5-unit coming available. I said, okay, well, I'd love to hear about that. I don't know, I know that falls into commercial property at that point, but I'd never done any commercial properties. So she told me about it. I got that under contract, but then I had 3 rentals under my belt at that time, and I should have been ready for that property, but instead I had fear kind of set in again. I kind of started to think about, like, what if I had 2 tenants move out at the same time? Or what if something major broke? Or what if I couldn't manage it and renovate all these units that I needed to happen? So the leap from 3 to 8 doors felt massive. It was more than double my portfolio overnight, and I wasn't sure I could handle it at the time. My mindset at the time was small, and I saw problems, not systems. I saw work and not the leverage. And instead of asking, how can I get this done, I kept asking, what if I can't? And so I brought on a partner into that deal. And not because I needed a partner, but it's because I needed that security to have somebody else in that deal with me. I had the capital for the down payment, I had the financing in place, but I just didn't feel comfortable doing it. We ended up buying that property for $306,000. We renovated about 3 to 4 units, turned over the units, raised rents, and 18 months later we refinanced that property, got all of the down payment back out and some. And so in the end, that property doubled over about 4 years, and so I gave away about $150,000 equity just because of the fear of not jumping in that deal and doing it myself. I didn't believe in myself to do that deal. I was starting to get a little more versed at that point on kind of seller financing and learning about creative side of things, and we were kind of ready to move out of the duplex, and so we started looking for our next home. Found another deal on Craigslist. I was definitely in my flipping car days. I became very good at Craigslist, and you used to be able to find good deals on there. But I found a for sale by owner and ended up negotiating a seller carry terms on a house for us to move into. It was a short carry. I think it was only 2 years, but it needed some renovations, so I knew that was enough timeline for me to get it renovated and then refinanced on a cash out. This property was an interesting one because it had an ADU in the back of it, and looking back on it, for some reason I kept putting off renovating that ADU. I don't know why, but it ended up taking me. I don't think I finished that ADU until last June. We finally got it finished, and I bought this I think 5 years prior to that. But I was in the mindset of you got to do all your own work yourself, and that's how you gain equity. And I didn't understand the opportunity cost that I was missing out on that property of just hiring a contractor, getting them in there and getting the project done. So I lost 5 years of rent on that place. And we ended up turning that into an Airbnb last year that's grossing like around $6,000 a month on Airbnb. And so, I mean, I could have been renting that entire time. So I always recommend to people to definitely look at your opportunity cost of doing the work yourself sometimes. And if you want to scale, sometimes it's good to get a contractor in place. So at this time, I had achieved as an engineer, I had achieved my job that I was like that new Everest that I wanted. I was working from home about 30 to 40 hours a week, good pay. It's pretty easy. It allowed me to my time flexibility to keep my real estate portfolio going and keep investing. But I still felt unfulfilled, and I had hit another plateau of what I thought like the top was. And I realized that even the perfect job can be the wrong path that pulls you from your purpose. And I remember arguing with my boss at that time. It was probably 2020. He was wanting to give me like 3 to 4% raise, and I was seeing inflation of like 8%. They were also asking me to do more work the following year for essentially less pay because of inflation. So I started looking for a deal that I could get to passively replace my income as an engineer. I had replaced some of it with my other investment properties, but I wanted to find something that was big enough that I could replace it and some to get that security as well. So I found a 20-unit apartment deal online. I didn't quite understand how to underwrite these at the time, but I kind of dove into the numbers, and everything at that point comparative to looking at duplexes and fourplexes looked amazing. So I was about ready to call the for sale by owner on this one as well, and I saw it went pending online. And I had that heart sink feeling like, man, I had it all lined up, ready how I was going to talk to him and have that conversation, but just kept pushing it back, and it went pending. So then about a month later, the property popped back online, and I picked up the phone immediately. I called the seller and I said, hey, I have a $150,000 HELOC, and I know I need about $400,000 for the down payment on this property. Would you be willing to carry back $250,000 of the down payment on the $1.6 million property? He said, hey, let's meet for lunch and check out the property. And so I ended up driving up there to meet him that next week. We kind of discussed what I had done to that point and what I wanted to do going forward, and my plan of getting this passive income, replacing my job. He said, I'll tell you what, I'll do the deal on 2 conditions. He says, I want you to collateralize the loan against 2 of your properties, 2 of my single family homes. And he says, I want you to pay this forward someday. And I said, I had no idea how I was going to do that, but I knew that I'd figure it out along the way. I ended up inspecting all 20 units myself on that property. I don't recommend it. I would hire an inspector. I remember taking lots of videos. I wrote down every problem that was wrong with each unit so that I knew day one when I took over, I would do the problems that were the biggest, causing damage on the property, and then kind of work my way down the line. Ended up negotiating about $50,000 off the asking price, and then I closed on that property May 29th of 2021. Now there's scary, and then there's this kind of scary. So I quit my job that same day, and I closed on the 20-unit apartment building, and then my second kid was born 3 days later. Now most people would call that insane, and honestly, in the moment, so did I. I had built a career in the engineering and had that remote job, that 401k, kind of that what I thought was my new plateau of what I wanted to be at. And I was walking away from it all. The weight of that decision wasn't just financial, it was emotional. I had a family, a newborn, and people that depended on me. And the fear hit hard. I said, what if this deal flops? And what if I can't support my family? And what if I made the wrong call? So I asked myself a simple question. What is the worst thing that can happen if I go for it and I fail? And then I started to think, I'd say, I go back to work, or I pick up another W-2 job. I said, that was my life already. That was my baseline that I was living at the moment. And in that moment, I realized something. If the worst case is going back to where I started, then it isn't a risk, it's an opportunity. And so I left, not because I wasn't scared, but because I finally believed the life I wanted was worth betting on. And while sitting at the hospital, my wife and my newborn were sleeping, I was onboarding tenants in my new property management software. My one sane thought, though, was that I looked back on the moments in the past. I remembered when I bought that first single-family home, and then looked back on that home 2 years later, and kind of laughed at the fear I had at that moment. And I looked back at that 5-unit apartment building that I had bought, and I thought about it 2 years later, and laughing about the fear that I had at that moment as well. Once I took over that building, I helped renovate the first unit myself. I did a lot of the work myself, and I quickly realized that there was no way that I was going to keep up doing all the work myself on these buildings. So I got a team of handymen and people to do the work. The building came with some guy that had been doing work, and then he hired a couple more people. And over the next, we raised rents, put utility surcharges in, and changed over management. Well, I was still the property manager, but we had an on-site manager that was helping with just showing units and stuff for me. So I was, up to this point, still managing all my own properties. Renovated about 8 of the units over the first 18 months, and then I ended up refinancing that property about 18 months later, 18 months from the purchase price, and it appraised for $2.7 million, and they pulled out about $650,000 in cash. And at that moment, I knew that I was onto something, that I found something I'm good at, and I enjoyed it. I was living a dream of, doing something that wasn't for somebody else. I made my own hours, and I enjoyed what I was doing. I was making these units better for the tenants, and making the whole building to where people were happier to live there. Obviously, increasing rents along the way, but many times when I got done renovating a unit, I had a tenant from another unit wanting that unit and willing to pay a higher price because they liked the upgrades that we were doing. So I immediately put all that money that I had gotten from the refinance into some CDs, because at the time I think my mortgage was at 4% and I was getting 5% in a CD just sitting there. So over the next, I kind of had felt like, okay, I'd gotten to this point, I quit my job. 18 months later, I'm going to kind of coast for a little while. And I quickly realized that I'm not a person who can just coast for very long. I'm a person that has to be going and finding that next thing. So I did a couple projects. I finished up that ADU, or started working on the ADU. I bought another property that was like a split level home. But I was like, okay, I'm ready for that next big deal to happen. And that's when I got sent by a broker. I started connecting with brokers at the time, and I got sent a 27-unit apartment building. The building was listed. It was funny because in 2020 I saw this building listed for $1.2 million, and I definitely wasn't ready for it at that time, but it reappeared in 2023 for $2.2 million. The building was about a quarter mile from my other property, so I had direct comps of what rents could be. I had my workforce in place for renovating the units. And so I went and did the walk with the broker and submitted a full price offer. Now looking back, I probably didn't need to do a full price offer, but I was ready to make that next jump. So offer got accepted, I think a couple days later, and then that's when I went and talked to my wife and said, hey, we're under contract on a $2.2 million apartment building. She said, great, but we are leaving on a 6-week camping trip in 3 weeks. And we had planned a trip for a long time that we were going to do with the kids through southern Utah. We planned to hit 10 national parks and just, kind of been putting it off for a long time, and it was time to do it. So I decided I made my trailer kind of a mobile office. I got Starlink batteries, inverters, and solar panels. But I had to get this property going before I took off. So again, I went and inspected all 27 units myself, but this time I did hire an inspector. And the inspectors, most of the time they'll do about 1/3 of the units. I think you can probably ask for them to do more if you want. But since this was a 100-year-old building, I wanted to get my eyes on all the units and again get the fix-it lists of everything that I needed to jump into. So we got through the inspection, and just about after that, we took off on our trip.